Greetings all. Today I'd like to discuss climate zones and plant adaptation. Now, I've had a few questions lately from folks about USDA climate zone maps, people claiming they're inaccurate, and so on and so forth. Well, to begin with, when it comes to any mapping, it's only symbolic representation of some reality, whether it be roads, topography, weather, climate, and so on. And so, they give you a rough idea. They're not intended to be a pinpoint thing. They're basically broad brush strokes because they indicate climate, not weather. Those are different things, climate and weather. They're related, but they're not the same. Climate is the overall planetary picture of how the systems operate here. Weather are the little tiny things that operate inside climate, So, weather and climate are to be differentiated. And like I say, the USDA maps, well, these are broad brush strokes. They really can't take in, local micro climates and other small things that affect stuff. When you start planting, say, if a tree says it will exist to zone 8A, and you're planting it in 7A, and the plant survives, well, we could consider a few possibilities. It may be surviving because the particular thing you have there is a little hardier than most that have been logged previously. That happens, okay? That's why experimentation is a cool thing. On the other hand, we're talking climate. And sometimes, say in your area of zone 7, the conditions that would kill a plant that really should grow in zone 8, well, they might not happen for the next 10 years. That's the way climate is. You base this on 100-year intervals and 50-year intervals and so on when they're measuring weather and figuring out what climate is. So you may just not have reached the inevitable end with this plant yet. That's always possible. On the other hand, your specific location could be special. Sure. Right inside zone 7, you may have a microclimate that is much closer to zone 8. That happens. Or it could be the placement of where the plant went. Maybe you put it on the south side of a building that has a large overhanging eave or something like this that moderated the climate. So that doesn't mean that the USDA maps are wrong. No, that's not what that means. It just means you did something special, so you're kind of off the map, these are all possibilities. And again, there's another bigger picture. Perhaps it's a current threat. Climate does not remain the same. It's changed. I lived in Wisconsin for 15 years. The imprint of the last ice age on that state is massive. And so there was a time where my farmhouse had been under 1.5 miles of ice, and not long ago. 10,000, 12,000 years, something on that order. Not really that long ago. There were human beings around in those days, and my farm was under 1.5 miles of ice. So, climate changes. Now, whether today's climate change is propelled by fossil fuel burning, it's a good possibility. Statistics look pretty good in that regard, but whatever. Climate apparently is taking another change. And so the maps written from the last 200-year interval where things were pretty stable, they might have to be redrawn. That could be, easily could be. But like I say, the USDA maps they're written as a guideline. They help. I use them all the time. Just trying to figure out, roughly where, do plants lay in the scheme of things in your garden if you live in Missouri or Alaska or whatever. But The USD maps are not the most accurate, that were ever drawn, or most detailed. Sunset Publishing, the Sunset Western Garden people, Sunset Magazine, they've produced a series of maps that are far more detailed than the USDA ones. They break big zones into lots of little zones within those maps, and so you get a lot better idea. Now, I'd have to look at this. I don't know. Sunset once upon a time produced a national gardening tome that had national climate maps in it, and I possess one, but I know I bought it out of print. So I don't know whether they're still doing a national map. If you're on the West Coast or out here in Hawaii, Sunset has maps in their latest Sunset Western Garden books that are real good. That said about maps and the accuracy of maps and so on, as I say, these are only a guideline. I've been a plant experimenter most of my life. I will take things that aren't ordinarily known to grow in certain areas, and I will plant them there to see what happens. Sometimes I get surprises. Other times there are things that have very little knowledge around that they will grow there. But the knowledge is there if you look. And that's always cool too. White sapote in the Bay Area, for instance, is one of those where there were old existing trees in town. So it was obvious that the plant would survive if you had the right genetics. Macadamia nuts were not something that was found in the town where I lived in California, but I did see references in text to older trees that were in the Berkeley Hills. Sadly, one of the oldest macadamia nut trees in California, I think, was cut down for a new sports arena there on the campus at Berkeley. That was where I got my information that led me to believe maybe I can grow macadamia nuts in California, and sent me looking for a tree. So here we have a crop where it was entirely possible. I would say that my biggest concern with macadamia nuts in California was squirrels. That really the biggest problem. Other than that, the trees did really well. Certain varieties, though, see. So I'm not sure about them all. I know a friend had a Kate that he said was doing fine in Fremont. I had Beaumont, and Beaumont is an excellent choice. Excellent choice. Bears 2 crops of nuts a year. It's hardy enough for the Bay Area, at least. How much hardier, I don't know. I've seen evidence that it's possible the trees might even grow as far inland as Modesto. Yeah. I actually got my tree. Came from a nursery in Riverbank near Modesto. It was a Christmas gift from Ellen's parents. They'd ordered it for me. Yeah, so you don't really know. On the other hand, when you're, too far out, it's like, let's face it, folks, tropical crops, truly tropical things, they don't grow in temperate areas. Just don't do that. And even if you can manage, you're probably not going to come up with the right fruit quality. That's been my experience. But nevertheless, people endure to persevere, and they continue trying to plant things in climate zones where they ordinarily wouldn't have seen the plant growing. Some of you, I'm sure, are going to have success with this. It seems to be an international trend at the moment. The interest in tropical crops out of tropical areas. Part of it is mostly around fruit. It's more of a fruit thing that's happening. People are, bored with apples and cherries, tired of apricots, want to go a step beyond the peach. Yeah, one step beyond the peach. Perhaps, and I can think of plants that, I tried to grow Jabuta Cabba in Fremont for years, but I was always bringing my seed from Hawaii, and I never found a seed that I brought from this island back to the Bay Area that survived for long. They just didn't like the weather. Yet, Ranger Dave over at Quarry Lakes Regional Park, he had brought some plants from a nursery in Southern California of some variety of Jabuta Cabba that was obviously hardier, and his grew, his survived. And while looking for good genetics for Jabuta Cabba in the Bay Area, California, the 2 trees he has at Quarry Lakes would be a great source for genetics. They fruit over there regularly. If you can get fruit away from the ground squirrels. But yeah, so these are apparently a little hardier, but they're also on a peninsula jutting out into a lake. Used to be a gravel quarry there in Fremont. So you have this water moderation. You're not only right next to the Pacific Ocean, then you're right next to San Francisco Bay, then you're on a peninsula jutting out into a lake next to San Francisco Bay. So that's definitely a microclimate. You have a heat sink there from all that water, which is probably why this works at the park. They've had a lot of pretty borderline stuff he'd planted there that was doing okay. And I believe it's proximity to water, slope to the cold air drops downhill, that was helping him. I know of a mango in the city of Fremont. There is a video I did about it. Top of my head, it's the only mango I know of that I've ever seen fruiting in the Bay Area that wasn't being sheltered. Again, though, it's in an extremely unusual location, microclimate-wise. You know, it's a sunset zone 16 to begin with, which is in the Bay Area, absolutely, hands down, most favorable climate you could have. It's on slopes, you know, and the cold air sinks and goes downhill during the wintertime. And so generally speaking, cold on the Fremont Hills will settle down into the lower flat town of Fremont during the wintertime. And as it drains away, it leaves the temperature higher in the upslope regions, so frost doesn't settle there frequently. This particular tree is not only in the brow of the hills on a zone 16, but it's on its own little hill that's 360 degrees drainage all the way around. So it's a cold air sink drainage within a cold air sink drainage, and there's a mango there. I'm not sure of the variety. So so we're back to genetics again. I found that bananas, for instance, were very difficult to raise in the Bay Area, yet there are varieties that will grow there. I did okay with ice cream. I did okay with numwa. There's a few types. Orinoco will grow in the Bay Area, and so on. In general, now there are kind of special rules about doing that because bananas are not really in the climate zone of San Francisco Bay Area. They're just not. They're out of it. But it's the nature of a banana plant, you see. The banana plant is a lily, not a tree. Now, if you freeze a tree and the cambium, the bark area, gets frozen, well, you've killed years worth of growth. And even if the tree remains alive at the trunk, it's still going to take forever to get itself back to where it might be able to fruit. But it might freeze again before that happens. Well, with bananas, they're a lily. They're layered in sheaths to begin with, so they're wrapped in layers of themselves. But they are also connected to a huge corm underneath the soil. That if the corm doesn't freeze, the banana survives. Okay, and above the ground, even if the leaves on top of the banana freeze, it doesn't mean that the trunk has frozen. And all the business is in the trunk, folks. Okay, I've seen people who go, "Oh, banana leaves froze. I better cut the plant down." Well, you'll never get any bananas that way. You leave them. You just let them be. See what happens. Wait for spring. Some varieties will choke. After a frost, the tip point will be burned, and it will not emerge. Maybe sometimes if you cut it off, it might, but other varieties will always emerge. They do not choke, even after a cold frost. I've seen plants that were actually leafless, that pushed out a flower stalk, that made a clump of bananas, that never had a leaf on it during the course of the growing season, because they'd froze off during the winter and the bud came too quick after in spring. Yet the other banana plants support that stalk. Yeah, there's leaves on other stalks. It's all hooked to a corm, and so they feed to the one that had the fruit on it. And so even leafless stalks will oftentimes fruit. So here we're talking about a plant that is not really classically adapted in the climate area, but with the right kind of care, placement, right variety, yeah, they can be done. Doesn't mean the climate zone map's wrong. No, that's not what that means. I even have banana difficulties here in Hawaii, in Mountain View. Mountain View's we're up high, and it's cooler. And because of that, not every variety of banana is going to grow up here. Some of them really like it hot. So most of the really dwarf types, they don't do well up here. The absolute finest is the apple, the Hawaiian apple. It's almost a weed here in Mountain View. And again, so genetically, that banana is a little different than, like, say, Williams or Cavendish or ice cream. These other varieties will grow here. Most of the dwarf Cavendish don't perform at all up here at this elevation. They're worthless. Bigger varieties of Cavendish, like a dwarf Williams, that's maybe a 12-foot stalk. That one, it does all right, but it has other problems. In the wind, the stems crack and so on. But that's got nothing to do with climate exactly. That's just wind protection. I see that there's call it a trend, I guess, towards tropical fruit growing in non-tropical regions. A trend towards tropical fruit growing in tropical regions too. But, here we can't raise a cherry worth a darn, and plums are really out of the question and so on. We get borderline with a few things like blackberries, blueberries, some grapes, and, I get a few apples off a few low-chill apple trees, but it's really marginal here trying to grow temperate crops. They're not easy. There's only just a bare few that I've ever experimented with that will actually do pretty well here in Hawaii. Most not worth the trouble. Too many problems, or mostly just climate or day length problems too here for a lot of temperate crops. Well, you have the opposite situation. If you're living on the mainland, you're in Minnesota or Kansas or wherever you might be, there you're at best, maybe you're living in a subtropical zone. There are no tropical zones in the mainland. Most of you are in temperate latitude zones. The favorable zone 6 USDA cuts right through the middle of the country through St. Louis and that. And, it's a great zone. There's a lot of things that raise in zone 6. There might be more things actually that cross over in zone 6 that we can grow here in Hawaii because we're fully tropical. Anyway, it would be my opinion, and that's all, is that I've messed around with exotic crops in places where they ordinarily aren't seen over the years. And as I stated, a few of them, like raising mac nuts in California, or raising some banana varieties in California, were successful, were worth the effort, and the quality of the crops came out good. On the other hand, I've raised a whole lot of other things like tropical guavas, for instance, pineapple, and so on. In California, in climates where they were really not suited, I've attempted to raise quite a few things out of their climate zone over the years, or sometimes things that we really didn't even know what the climate zone was going to be, and this is the case too. By the way, there are many plants that we don't really know. And so the only way you're going to find out is you're going to have to plant the stuff and see what happens to it. But more often than not, the experience that I've had with trying to grow things out of zone, it's not really been worth it. That's my opinion. To begin with, crops are associated to climates and weather, and so if you don't have the right climate and weather, you're not going to be able to produce the maximum quality in whatever it is you're trying to grow. It's like I'd bring slips back from Hawaii to California years back for white pineapple. Well, I could fruit them there in the greenhouse. Yeah, I mean, I'd leave them out in the summertime, but I'd move them into the greenhouse, and I could fruit the white pineapples in the Bay Area. But they never even came close to the quality of the ones that I could get out here in the field under the Hawaiian sun. And so mostly I would just grow them to sell as nursery items to people who were interested as far as the reality of, growing a pineapple in the Bay Area. You can do it, but you probably buy a better one at the supermarket. Same happened to me with guavas. I raised guavas for years in the Bay Area, and I eventually donated the entire mess to Ranger Dave at Quarry Lakes, and he planted them out there because they would bear fruit. I could get them to bear fruit, but most of the fruit they produced would come during the winter time. Well, the weather in the Bay Area is not suitable for ripening guavas properly during the wintertime, and so the skins would crack, they'd freeze. If they did ripen out, they wouldn't have the sugar content they should have had, and so on and so forth. I'd get 3 or 4 guavas a year that came kind of off-season towards the summer that would ripen under California sun that were really good. 3 or 4 a year wasn't worth the effort, The same's true with almost any other tropical crop I tried to raise in the Bay Area. The vast majority of them, if I could get them to come on, they'd produce. But I'd have been better off growing an apricot. I'd have been way better off raising a peach or an apple, because it's not how weird it is, folks. It's how good it is. Boy, I don't know why. If there was a way that I could, still grow the Fuji apples here that I used to have while I lived in the Bay Area, and I can't do that. There's no way. It was the weather. I have a good branch of Fuji stuck in an apple tree over here out in the front yard, and it grows. Yeah. I haven't flowered so far. Whether it will ever flower, because it takes about 400 chilling hours, we get 0. But even if it does flower, and even if it does produce fruit, in the Bay Area, as the fruit ripened, the temperatures would be dropping in fall. The apples could be left to hang in the tree, almost semi-refrigerated, until they developed sugar spots that was like, wow, they were like apple juice concentrate. They were so good, and they wouldn't get mealy or soft because the temperature was dropping. Here, I could never achieve that. The temperature is always fairly mild. The apples, if I left them that long, even if I could get an apple on the tree, it would probably ripen out mealy. See? Yeah. So, weather, climate, crop, boy, they're like this. And so, I'm not telling people, don't mess around with strange stuff. There's a joy in that, and when you can achieve the impossible, it's great. I've done this, okay, so I know how it feels, right? But I've done it so many times that I've also realized, the solution to food growing is finding those crops that are perfectly adapted to the region where you live. And, as climate becomes weirder and more harsh, as we get more droughts and, tornadoes and things like this, you may find that's even more limited than it used to be, Arizona, with its heat, for instance, we traditionally always raised citrus, in Arizona, and Arizona's probably a pretty good place for that, but chances are there's a lot of crops that have been raised in regions that as climate shifts may not be suitable anymore. France is freaking over their grapes. It's getting hotter and hotter. It's ruining the quality of the fruit. They're not getting the same kind of wine out of the grapes that they once were, and the plants are being damaged by heat and drought, and the yield is also being reduced. So it was a marginal business anyway. Now they're making even less money on it, and the quality of the product isn't nearly as good. Now you got a problem when it comes to wine. If what you're raising is a Bordeaux grape, and people are used to buying a Bordeaux wine, if you change the variety you've put in the bottle, it's not Bordeaux anymore. And so grapes are really in trouble. Yeah, we can change the variety of tangerine we're selling you in that box and cuties or something, and it's not going to matter too much to you as long as it tastes good. Same thing, maybe with many other different types of crops that we eat. But when it comes to wine, boy, it's very sensitive to varietal and region. So there you go. They're going to have to start to maybe move some of the wine growing regions, and I don't think that's going to be very expedient for the existing farmers. At least, grapes that were raised in California, for instance, that used to work well there may end up in Oregon. This because things seem to be shifting somewhat towards the poles. Well, folks, there's my comments on climate mapping and crop adaptation. Aloha. Y'all hang loose.